Welcome to SLP Nerdcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Amy, and we appreciate you tuning in. In our podcast, we review and provide commentary on resources, literature, and we discuss issues related to the field of speech-language pathology.
You can use this podcast for ASHA CEUs. Visit our website for other courses, including live courses, webinars, blog posts, and SLP Masterclasses available for graduate level credit. SLP Nerdcast is committed to improving continuing education in our field through affordable pricing and open access libraries. You can support our work by leaving a review, referring a friend, making a one-time contribution on our website, or subscribing. You can subscribe for as low as $7 a month and get access to monthly Q&A sessions, exclusive content, discounts, and a resource library of downloads, freebies, and printables. Want unlimited access to ASHA CEU courses? There's an affordable subscription for that too. For more information, visit us on our website or contact us anytime on Facebook, Instagram, or at info@slpnerdcast.com. We love hearing from our listeners, and we can't wait to connect with you.
And just a quick disclaimer, the contents of this episode are not meant to replace clinical advice. SLP Nerdcast, its hosts, and guests do not represent or endorse specific products or procedures mentioned during our episodes unless otherwise stated. We are not PhDs, but we do research our material. We do our best to provide a thorough review and a fair representation of each topic that we tackle. That being said, it's always likely that there's an article that we've missed or another perspective that we haven't shared. If you have something to add to the conversation, please email us. We love hearing from our listeners.
This episode is brought to you in part by listeners like you and one of our amazing corporate sponsors, MedTravelers. MedTravelers is your industry leader for exclusive allied healthcare travel opportunities. MedTravelers has benefits like higher earning potential, W-2 employee status, and a flexible schedule. Visit medtravelers.com to learn more. MedTravelers did not participate in creating the contents of this episode. We're so excited for the topic of today's episode. This is an area that's very near and dear to us, and we get to welcome a woman who we've worked with before and collaborated with before, who we've learned so much from already. Welcome, Tana Neufeld. We're so happy to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I've been excited to join you guys for a while. I'm glad to finally have the chance.
We are too. We're so happy that you're sharing your time with us. Now, Tana, you are here today to talk to us about AAC and complex communicators in early intervention. But before we get started, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I live in Seattle, Washington, and my primary job is working as a clinical instructor at the University of Washington. So I get to work with graduate students, and I love that. I also get to teach their AAC class, which I really love. And I think that it has really become evident to me how important it is to improve our pre-service education through my role in that class. So I'm excited to talk a little bit about that today. In addition to that, I do some private work as an AAC consultant with children and families over telehealth. And I am the founder and director of accessible.org, Accessible Foundation, where we provide low cost and free resources to the community around AAC. Other than that, I'm a mom. I have 2 kids who I love and who teach me all the time about how to be a better person and a better therapist. I might be leaving some things out, but these are the broad strokes for sure.
I'm just going to be the first one to say that you do so many things and you've contributed so much to this field already. So hats off to you. Especially your foundation, the Accessible Foundation, accessible.org, is so full of resources and webinars. Anybody who's listening, we haven't even gotten into the topic of today's episode, but if you want to learn more or join a community around AAC education and support, then that is the place where you need to go. And you guys have a conference coming up. You're doing like an actual conference.
Yeah, scary, right? So we're taking a stab at what I believe is the first conference of its kind, really. Coming up in February on the 16th and the 17th, we're going to be hosting 2 full days of an online only live conference on the topic of early intervention for complex communicators. So it's called the AAC Early Starts Conference. And you can see some workings of the initial information on that conference on our website. We have a call for papers open for that as well. We're looking for presenters, and we really want it to be a conference for families and professionals across disciplines to come and present and share their knowledge and experience, and also attend to learn how to support these really young early communicators who have these complex needs a little bit better for longer term outcomes that really help them be independent members of society.
I'm incredibly impressed for a variety of reasons. And I think it's a great segue into today's topic, because as you and I were having conversations about AAC in early intervention, having not worked in early intervention, it became abundantly clear that this is really an area that deserves a spotlight and deserves more discussion and continuing education. And I'm so excited that you're here to give us a little sneak peek, give us a little preview, and teach us all the things. So before we really jump into it, the powers that be require that I read our learning objectives and disclosures. I will get through them as quickly as possible, and then we can get on to the good stuff. So here we go. Learning objective number 1, identify at least 2 barriers to AAC implementation in an early intervention setting. Learning objective number 2, identify at least 5 strategies to overcome barriers to AAC implementation in an early intervention setting. And learning objective number 3, identify at least 2 resources for expanding scope of competence in AAC for early intervention clinicians. Disclosures: Tana Neufeld's financial disclosures. Tana receives a salary from the University of Washington and receives donations for consultation services, mentoring services, course offerings, and products on accessible.org. A portion of these donations is used to subsidize overhead costs for an organization which she founded and directs. Tana receives honorariums for speaking at conferences and workshops in the Seattle community. She is a paid advisor and consultant for Goalie, an assistive technology company. She is also a seller on Teachers Pay Teachers and Boom Learning, for which she receives funds for her products. Tana Neufeld's non-financial disclosures: Tana is a member of ASHA and ASHA SIG 1, 11, and 12. She is president on the board of Accessible Foundation and a volunteer contributing editor for SLP Nerdcast. Kate, that's me, financial disclosures. I am the owner and founder of Grand Bois Therapy and Consulting, LLC, and co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. My non-financial disclosures: I'm a member of ASHA SIG 12 and serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm also a member of the Berkshire Association for Behavior Analysis and Therapy, MassABA, the Association for Behavior Analysis International, and the corresponding Speech Pathology and Applied Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group.
Amy, that's me. My financial disclosures are that I am an employee of a public school system and I receive compensation as co-founder of SLP Nerdcast. And my non-financial disclosures are that I'm a member of ASHA SIG 12 and I serve on the AAC advisory group for Massachusetts Advocates for Children. All right, we've done it. We've made it through the learning objectives, the disclosures, onto the good stuff. Tana, why don't you start us off by just telling us a little bit about the barriers to AAC in early intervention?
Yeah, so I have been so fortunate to spend a good part of my career working in early intervention, even though that's not really where I am exclusively right now. And so some of the thoughts I'll share today are coming from my own experience in that setting, and also from the collaboration and consultation I do with a lot of the EI providers here in the Seattle area who really struggle to feel confident in the care that they're providing for complex communicators, and rightfully so. So I think that the first barrier that I kind of discovered myself as an EI provider, and also through my support of others, is that really these really young little guys in early intervention are so complex, some of them, right? So in addition to being young, infants, toddlers, and preschoolers, those with complex needs are still developing all of their skills, right? They have not had a chance yet to have a foundation in anything. So these providers who are supporting these little ones are supporting them at the beginning of every journey that they are on, right? And that's a huge, huge job. One that we're not very prepared for, I think, as providers across domains, but obviously as SLPs. So I think about that first, and that leads me into kind of the second one, where I think that despite our efforts to equip our professionals with the skills they need to be good at what they do when they graduate, our pre-service education still tremendously lacks the skills and experiences needed to really serve birth to 3 populations in general, and let alone birth to 3 populations with complex needs. We don't even have coursework in many of our programs that talk anything about parent coaching or partner involvement. So I think our SLPs operating in these contexts are really trying their best to do what they need to do when they've been thrown into the deep end of the pool, pretty much on two fronts, right? So those would be my top two barriers that I see. I also think that in these settings, because early intervention is wonderfully a program that serves all families, right? No matter what their background. We do have a lot of families and areas in early intervention districts, right? So early intervention is usually assigned to a certain, part of the community. And in certain communities, technology is not available. Resources are very limited. And so our EI providers are really trying to create access to technology that'll support the needs of these really complex little guys with very minimal budget or opportunity to do so, right? So we have limited access to technology. And I think we also just have limited access to training that's specifically around how to implement AAC in this very unique and special setting.
I was going to say, this is something that we've discussed a lot in previous episodes that we've done, that access to AAC content knowledge and then confidence and competence in applying those skills is something that is an issue. It's an issue because there's these quote unquote, you feel like you have to be a specialist. You feel like you have to have your ATP. There are a lot of barriers just in general to implementing AAC. And when you look at it through the lens of early intervention, I love how you laid that out, that these little people are at the beginning of this journey. And you're right, we don't get a lot of structured education. I didn't have a course in early intervention. Actually, as a matter of fact, I didn't have any clinical experiences in early intervention either. Did you, Amy?
I mean, I feel like it was tied in. We had some child development courses, but no, there was nothing dedicated to EI. And I also did not have experience working with that population until my CF year. So it was not something that I encountered in grad school at all.
And to sort of piggyback onto that, I think you're right. There are so many components of early intervention that are separate from working in a school and separate from working in an outpatient clinic, where you're really wanting to focus on not only person-centered care, but family support and caregiver training. I mean, these are such tiny little babies. They're little tiny people. I keep saying tiny. They're physically small. They're really young. And supporting them in that environment is such a I have to assume, a very different skill set. I've never done it myself. Would you agree?
Yes, it's a super different skill set. And in my experience, it's a work setting that's highly protected in a lot of ways. In some districts, it's protected, right? So similar to maybe if I'm a grad school graduate and I want to work in a NICU, right? And the NICU people are like, yeah, you're gonna have to pay some dues before you get to do that, right? Because it's a very coveted, protected area of our field. And in some places, EI is like that too. And so you'll have some EI providing companies that are very particular about training their providers. But then there's also a shortage of SLPs willing to do a job that requires them to largely spend the majority of their day in their car, right? So I think you've got this weird contrast that makes the services obviously not very uniform, where you may get some younger providers who are just getting their feet out there, right? Hitting the ground running. And now they're in their car, in the homes, with minimal mentorship from anyone who knows anything about what to do with some of these more complex cases. So it's just a lot to learn on the job, I think. And I think a lot of providers get a little burn out by the feeling that they're not doing what they should be doing or could be doing, or they don't know what to do, mainly because of all of the reasons we just talked about, right? Just lack of support, lack of training, lack of time. There's high productivity demands in the EI setting because there's always kids waiting, and they're not allowed to wait for very long because there's mandates on how long they can wait. And so, all that indirect service stuff you guys talk about so much on this show, it applies here too. There's not enough time to create to build an iPad in your garage because the family doesn't have the means to do it. We need to have that. We need to be able to build stuff. We need 3D printing time, that sort of thing.
Well, and you talked about not just knowing what to do with your client, but also in EI, so much of it, you're in somebody's home, you're working with families, the entire family unit is your client, essentially. And I think that must add another layer for the clinician who not only has to learn what to do with the actual child on their caseload, but how to best support that family in that context. So there are almost 2 layers of clinical skills, which you may or may not find as a demand in some other work settings to the same degree.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember as a CF, my first experiences were a clinic where the families never even came into the room, right? And that was the way I learned in graduate school too. And so when I went and started a job at a really family-centered practice, I was like, wait, they're going to be in the room with me? Well,
Right.
And as a grad student, you're like, oh my gosh, please don't look, I'm making a mistake. You feel like so under a microscope. Your supervisor is there, and then the parents, and it's a really intimidating setting.
It is. And so, I mean, we haven't gotten to this part in our talk yet, but I think speaking to what you asked, Amy, about this big job of not only learning it yourself, but teaching families, I think one of the things we need to do as a field is assure that our pre-service experiences for graduate SLPs include families being in the room. And it is harder, and they're going to mess it up. I've seen it. They get so nervous, but I think you have to learn by doing. And what better place in your career to do that than when somebody is right there to help you be better at it, right?
Totally. We're like high-fiving Tana through the screen. This is just so brilliant. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about why it matters. And stick with me for a second, right? So you have a person, a child, I wanted to say tiny child again, but I stopped myself. A young child under the age of 3 who is possibly medically complex or has a complex developmental profile, who presumably you're working in a team environment. You have potentially OT, PT, working on some basic skills, focusing on sitting, crawling, trunk support, walking, all of these kinds of things. And at least, I don't know if this is true, but what in many areas, but in our area, what I hear a lot is that SLPs aren't assigned to the team until later because of these, and I'm putting these in quotations, developmental norms, that's in quotations, of not needing access to communication support until they're 18 months or 2 years or whatever the cutoff is. I'm not really sure. I'm speaking out of turn there, but in terms of AAC knowledge and application of AAC knowledge, can you tell us a little bit about how important that is and why that matters, how that paradigm might need to shift a bit?
Yeah, and I can tell like a little bit of a personal experience too. When I first started in true EI, in Florida, EI was a little different, which is where I started my career, was in Florida. EI was not mandated to be in the home. And so I worked at a multidisciplinary center at the time where I was seeing little guys, little cuties, and helping them in the center. But then when I got here to Seattle, I started in a home-based center, and they did something called a primary service delivery model. I don't know if that's a thing other places, because I've lived here for a while now. But anyway, primary service delivery is kind of what you're talking about, Kate, and this idea that if I'm a little baby and I have just been born with cerebral palsy, for example, and I go to an early intervention setting and I get an evaluation, despite the fact that everybody on the team acknowledges that I am at risk for long-term speech and language challenges, the likelihood that I will have an SLP assigned exclusively to me as part of my care team is very small, because for some reason there's a desire or a thought that the needs of a very young communicator can be met by a non-language trained professional. So although they're not clearly stating that they don't need communication intervention. That's not the question or the key point here. The point, I believe, is that, well, of course they need it, but it can be provided by another professional. And I always had a hard time with that because I used to say to my superiors at the time, well, but you wouldn't look to me to help him walk, right? So
well
why
said.
are you looking to my wonderfully talented, amazing PT colleague to help him learn how to communicate? So, I think the importance here starts in, we need the best skilled professionals for each domain intervening. And we know how essential birth to 3 is. This is the window for language for sure, right? So why we wouldn't have then a language expert on the team just seems, in my opinion, to be frank, another situation where limited resources and such are kind of interfering with care provision, right? So, in perfect teams, it works really nicely for the SLP to push in and help. But I think what we're missing then is we're missing all of this immersion in particularly AAC that needs to happen from the time the child's born. Right? We need to immerse them if we want them to learn any language. So whether they are actually going to use an AAC system at all themselves before they exit EI, they need to be exposed to models. And PTs, OTs, and education, they don't normally have the skills to do that, to provide that service. I don't know if I answered your direct question or if I just got onto a little miniature soapbox.
No, it was, I wanted you to get on the soapbox because I think it's such a great point. And I think Amy can probably speak to this a little bit more based on her experiences in the school. But my assumption is that without those supports and without that immersion and without that foundation, I'm assuming you're at high risk for, quote, graduating from early intervention or transitioning into a preschool system without the communication system or supports that you need to continue your language learning journey.
Yes. And one of the hugest challenges for preschool teachers when they receive children who don't have a solid functional communication system is that they are now have shifted from being a preschool teacher to the person who is in charge of now teaching a child a language that their peers have entered into that setting already having, right? So no wonder our preschool teachers in developmental preschool and our kindergarten teachers, even when children enter public school at that point, are so overwhelmed because they're not trained to teach children language. That's not their job. I mean, I think many of them embrace it and want to do better, but it's no wonder it feels overwhelming and hard because that's not really the way that school was designed to be. So I think that we do a better service to our teachers and our teams, families and kids when we try our best to see into the longer term future and think about things in terms of typical development, right? So if I am a 12-month-old child, I have some skills that I need to develop around communication. And if I'm not doing those with speech or sign, then I need to have the ability and the opportunity to build them some other way, even at 12 months old. So I don't know, it seems like a no-brainer to me, but it's hard sometimes to get people to see it that way. And I also think a lot of the time we're just waiting for skills to be present, right? Prerequisite skills to be present. And that's where the myth comes in, right? Yeah, Kate's doing a fist bump. Fist bump.
I'm
pump,
feeling enthusiastic.
Bump,
it was
pump,
fist pump. There you
it was
go.
a bump, yeah. So yeah, the prerequisite skill myth, even though I think that if you get a bunch of us in a room, we would all say, no, we don't think about that anymore. We know that that's not true, but our practice is not following that, right? Because we're still waiting for these kids to show some magical unicorn cognition skill before we say, hey, let's just do this. Let's just, for lack of a better analogy, let's throw some stuff at the wall and see what sticks, right? Like this is the time to do it.
I go ahead, Amy.
I would, and it makes me think about something we've talked about a fair amount on this podcast before, but the idea of a communication system also, it doesn't just have to be this one high-tech thing that we bring in, and that seems like maybe it's too much for the situation. Just like you just said, Tana, you could, if you give yourself permission to try these different things at an early age, you can get a better feel for what works best for the child, what works best for their family. Maybe something works best in certain situations, but not in others. But if you don't have the opportunity to model and give that exposure and also give that practice for everybody, you're not going to have any of that information. And then the child's going to have a transition out of VI, and the people who are familiar and do know the child aren't going to have been able to gather that information to share with the receiving placement. And that's another piece that's really unfortunate.
And I think this is a great segue into our second learning objectives in terms of what we can do. So instead of waiting for an arbitrary developmental milestone or cognitive skill or arbitrary timeline, so we provide speech therapy at 18 months just because. What can we do? I mean, what are some proactive things that SLPs who are listening in an early intervention setting or interested in an early intervention setting, or maybe frustrated with their current early intervention setting, what are some shifts or different lenses that we can look through to improve on this problem?
Yeah, and I just thought of another barrier, so I'm going to
go back. That's
no,
cool.
It's not really going back so much as it's just nudging another little one in between before we start talking about solving the barrier. But so when Amy mentioned this, the idea of multimodal communication, right? So not really being so narrow focused on the AAC device as the system, but realizing that all this funky hand stuff that I'm doing right now is AAC, my vocal tone, my gaze, even my quirky behaviors, right? Those are all part of a system that an EI team should be building. And I do a lot of trainings on intervention. And I think people get a little frustrated when they sign up at first because they're like, why don't you talk about the actual devices? And I think it's because in my perspective, when I'm working with emerging communicators, the technology is 10%. 90% is all the other things. And I think sometimes EI providers have this barrier, self-imposed or otherwise, where it's well, we got to just teach them to use this device. Whereas they might feel more successful if they were thinking about typical development and what children need to gain in order to have better success with the AAC device or book or whatever we're doing. So teaching intention. I can't even tell you how many times I've gotten reports from EI and school districts, this child has no intention, so we're not going to call in speech yet because they have no intention. And I was well, last time I checked, babies aren't born with intention, and it's shaped through interaction. And that's AAC. That is complex communication therapy, right? It's not an AAC device, but it's part of this little niche of our field of providing services to children who don't talk and don't have all of the precursor skills that we feel they need to have verbal communication that we expect. So yeah, I think that barrier of just having that blinder on really limits the programming, because then what you see is goals that are just jumping canyons, right? A child has no intention, but they want them to use a Big Mac to say more. Big Macs are great. The word more is great. However, there's probably about 800 skills that you also should be working on to help that child actually have a strong foundation to move to symbolic communication. So on that note, I would say my first strategy would be recognizing the strengths in the child. And I think it kind of, not just the child, the family, and the team. So starting with the child, I think recognizing strengths means focusing on goal setting and intervention strategies that really truly scaffold and don't just say you're 2, so you should be making sentences. So I'm going to give you a PECS book that says I want goldfish because you're 2 and you should be making sentences. So rewinding and saying, okay, well, what do you do really well? Well, you're really intentional. You have great gestures, but you only say more with your sign. right? So going from this to I want goldfish, huge canyon leap in goal setting and intervention. But thinking about early childhood language development, we know, well, I really need to be building your single word vocabulary to a Brown stage 1 so that you have the building blocks that you need to make sentences and actually have that skill stick, right? So I think recognizing strengths help us not say, well, this is what you can't do, so I need to teach you this. It says, this is what you can do, and this is the next step. So I'm going to teach that so that I can get you to what you can't do. Okay, I'm seeing excitement, so I don't know if I should keep going or not.
No, I think that this is a really wonderful and important lens to look through. It's critical for early intervention. It's also a really important piece of being a person-centered therapist in terms of looking at per individual strengths and choosing targets and writing goals that are empowering and appropriate based on, the individual's presentation, not because you just chose it because you think that's what they should do. And I think that that's a really important distinction, and I'm really glad that you brought it up.
I also feel like when you're learning about somebody's strengths, you're also learning about who they are. And all of our clients are people and everybody's different, and we all, even down to, some clients really appear to enjoy like a high affect and, really exuberant interaction style. And for some folks, that's just the worst, right? So I think that that's got to be a piece that kind of tags along with that, recognizing the strengths. You're also kind of figuring out a bit about who your client is as a person, and that'll serve you well with all of your, later therapy with that individual and their family.
Absolutely. And I was just giving a training yesterday because I'm preparing to do some talks in the future on the power of joy in learning in general, but really just the power of joy in learning AAC, because we have children, right, who are complex communicators that don't have typical sources of joy. And so it saddens me sometimes, not just for the child, but for the professional, when I have a mentoring relationship with professionals where they're like, I've got this student and they just don't like anything. They don't like anything. And we know that that is not true. That is completely not true. But what an overwhelming place to be as a professional when you got into this field and you know how important joy is to children and learning, but you just can't tap into it. So yeah, I think you're right. Making sure you're looking at those strengths, what across all domains, right? Like, what are their sensory strengths? Meaning, what are their preferences, right? What are their motor strengths? What are their cognitive strengths, social strengths, right? We have a lot of kids who have social strengths, but don't seem to have a lot of other skills like good vision or good motor. It's part of getting to know them and knowing what brings them joy so that you can model the right words at the right time. So I've been encouraging my students and my families that I work with to really try to think beyond the traditional stuff that we think is supposed to bring joy, right? I was just doing a training yesterday where I challenged the audience to think about what core language could you model for a young one who likes to stick their head on the fan, right? Like blowing their hair in the wind and brings them joy. Like, what could you target during this activity rather than just saying, that's not play. Let's come over here and do this. They came up with like 50 words.
And I mean, who are we to say what brings someone else joy? That's just the most, I don't know, that's clinician-centered, not person-centered. That has nothing to do with you. You are there to support the other person, not make decisions for them. I mean, think about how we would receive that as individuals. I love reading science fiction and fantasy. It's my jam. If someone came along, a teacher, or I don't know, I was taking some sort of cooking class and they were like, that's not really okay, I would say, forget you. I'm not speaking to you anymore. That's mean. Why would we do that to children, right? Sorry, maybe that was a weird personal soapbox to get on for a second, but I had to say it.
Well, you're right. And I think, to be clear, I personally don't believe we do this on purpose. But I think that one of the things I've learned about myself, and I've learned about several other people that are SLPs, if I'm being gently honest, is we tend to be a little controlling in our personalities. And when you don't feel confident doing something, I think you tend to be even more so. And so I think it's harder to truly follow a complex communicator's lead, right? A child who likes to play with vacuums, it's really hard to figure out how to make that work. It's a lot easier to just teach them not to play with vacuums and to play with something else, right? So, I think that we don't do it on purpose, but we do it. We all do it. Educators do it. Everybody does. I think OTs are the only ones who don't really do it, honestly, because I think OTs are like magical. I want to be an OT when I grow up. But, we do it, and it's so crucial. So I'd say one of my strategies would be, and it wasn't even one I planned to share, but I think you're so right. The joy in getting to know the client still applies when you're teaching them hard things like AAC. That means we can't make every AAC practice opportunity contrived and boring. How many goldfish can I ask for, right? Before I'm just over it, right? That's not an interaction or an experience. That's a ritual and a behavior practice, right? So I think all this beautiful skill that a lot of our EI providers bring to naturalistic intervention for children who are not complex communicators, it's harder to translate to children who have complex bodies, visual impairments, sensory differences. And so bridging that gap, right, somehow by recognizing strengths, recognizing preference, and then figuring out how these skills can bridge that for these kids is a huge strategy. It's an idea. I didn't really give you any actionables on it, but it's an approach that you can take.
I think it creates a lot of really important self-reflection too about, how you approach and what your guiding principles are in therapy. I think it's a covert actionable. It's there. It's definitely there.
It's there. So you got to dig it out of the Cracker Jack box there. But yeah, I would also say, it's really important in this setting to recognize strengths in everyone. So I think a lot of the time what happens, right, is, and I get this a lot in trainings where I'll ask people what they want to learn, SLPs, educators and stuff in the room. And I want to learn how I can get this classroom teacher to follow through. And how can I get this parent to actually follow through, right? And so I think we spend some time really focusing on what parents and teammates are not doing, but maybe could spend a little bit more time figuring out what the strengths are. And so like at the beginning of a consultation for a young child's family, what I will do is observe what the parent's doing well. And the first piece of home program I give is to have them do more of it. Right? So it's like, you do this really well. I love how you give him choices. Your homework is to give him even more choices, right? So taking what they already do really well and building confidence through having them recognize how it's helping, recognize how their child is showing them that it's helping them feel empowered, right? Because so much of this AAC game is like all work, very little instant gratification. So you're asking a team to do really hard work with very little instant reward. I think it was David Bugelman who quoted in a book somewhere I read that AAC is like putting money in the bank, right? Like much of what we do is just investing. And our EI providers don't even get to see the benefits usually because the child goes on. Right? So it's thinking of money in the bank, and then that return on investment is going to happen in the long game. But it's helpful to help parents and teachers see, well, what does the little in return look like, right? Helping them figure out what is it that happens in my child when I do this thing that I do well. And then building on that with other skills that are not as easy for them to do. So, and then thinking also in terms of strategies, I think supporting those challenges. I think a lot of the times it's tempting to want to wait for things to develop, like we talked about in the beginning of the call, but we have to consider how to set the learning environment up to support challenge areas in order to have any sort of foundation for language learning. And I just gave a talk yesterday to an EI center specifically on this. So no AAC device even considered, are we doing our best to support this child's ability to move around their environment, right? Are we teaming enough to make sure they have some sort of mobility? Because mobility drives cognition. So if we're waiting for cognition to come to the table so that we can get going with AAC, we've got to be doing something to help it along. And that means urging mobility, right? Get them a little ride-on car, advocate for, ways to use a wagon or use some other form of mobility in their day. Or how are we adapting their play materials? So I'll often support families and providers who have great children with really impacted bodies, and they've got their Big Macs out in there, and they've got their, iPad that they're playing with, but none of their toys have been adapted for them. They can't even reach them from where they're sitting. And it isn't because they don't want to give the child toys they can play with. I think they just don't think about it. Like, how can I help you as a 2-year-old do what other 2-year-olds do that help them learn communication, language, and social skills? How do I help you draw? How do I help you paint? There's tons of beautiful adaptations that can be made to just set the stage for learning. And I think that's a huge piece of what EI needs to do, is really have that family understand this is a lifelong differentiated instruction job where this child's going to need us to help them access their world so that they have something to talk about.
I love that you are considering and continuing to remind us how important some of these other aspects are. I mean, they're important for our school-age kids and our high schoolers and even our adults. But it's so critical in these early years, and to consider all of these other aspects of development and how they may be strengths or there may be barriers there. It also makes me think of the importance of collaborative relationships, because you're working so closely. I think I'm going to go out on a limb here and say you're working more closely in early intervention with these collaborators than you are in a school setting or in a hospital setting where you all have your separate rooms and you just like maybe live on the same hallway, So I love the picture that you're painting of this multifaceted approach and how important it is. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what other things SLPs could do to sort of expand on that.
Yeah, I love that EI teams have this built-in collaborative kind of approach, right? And I'm going to allude to the training I did yesterday because it was an EI training, but it was, that's one of the things they bring to the table is this beautiful capacity to work with one another and not just do it on a lunch break, but actually like push in and jointly treat, right? In the home with everybody, with grandma, with Uncle so-and-so, with the dog. So I think one of the things I would consider hugely important is to make that a habit, not an exception. So if you have a child with complex communication needs, you absolutely should be prioritizing joint treatment with a motor therapist and a vision therapist, at least on occasion, once a month in your service delivery. It's only through partnering with them that we're truly treating the whole child in that moment. But also what I learned is by pushing in or having others join my sessions, I learned so much about other stuff that I didn't get taught in school, right? So I learned about vision and vision approaches. I learned about OT stuff, sensory processing and motor support. And so then I just became a more well-rounded therapist by being able to tap into the genius that was happening in front of me, right? I also felt that that was an opportunity for me to share what I thought could happen in that moment to promote communication. And my PTs and OTs were so grateful that I was there to not only tell them what I'd like them to do to help communication, but to actually show them how to do it. So yeah, I would make that a priority, pushing in and joining each other's sessions for sure. I also think that one of the demands placed on an EI provider, whether they like it or not, is the need to learn about things outside of speech pathology. And so I think that when you're serving complex communicators, it really behooves you to seek continuing education outside of just speech and language. Vision, motor, obviously, sensory integration, even relationships and infant and toddler interaction, all of these things that are really going to help you be more well-rounded in solving these really complicated problems.
And just for the sake of plugging this, if you do seek continuing education outside of speech pathology, it will still count towards your ASHA Cs, because ASHA's definition is anything where you are the learner, you have proof that you attended the event and you have a certificate, and it makes you a better speech pathologist will count. And you can quote me, it's on their website. So don't feel, I just want to second that because it's so important. And there are so many things that other fields have to offer that still make us better at our jobs. We are not, disciplinary centrism is real. Speech pathology doesn't know everything. There are lots of other wonderful resources out there. And so thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, and thank you for plugging the fact that it still counts, because I know that's really important to a lot of us, that it counts. And it's also can feel a little bit like stepping on toes to go into other realms. But remember that just getting knowledge to make you a more well-rounded therapist doesn't mean that you now become the fine motor expert. That's not a burden you need to carry, nor should you, right? I'm not an OT and I don't pretend to be one. However, I do realize that this is a whole child with a whole brain, and I can't just treat one piece of it. And I found in my practice, just getting to know other aspects has really made me feel more empowered and confident, and really has helped me understand my clients so much better. And I would also say another place to kind of address this collaboration piece is to really make sure that you are involving the parent as a true member of the team. So I think in EI, it's kind of assumed, well, yeah, it's family centered, but there are family centered sessions, and then there are family centered sessions. And I think we recognize how this work is largely to be done by families. So I think that to set the stage for longer term progress and success for families, you have to set that precedent at the beginning. You have to go in. Go ahead.
I was going to say, this brings us to a point you made earlier about how, the early intervention provider doesn't stay with the child for more than 18 months, 2 years, maximum 3. So by really making the family and the caregivers and the parents an integral part of therapy, you are empowering them to be there for the child for their life. And that's so much more than we can do.
Absolutely. And I think that takes considering the long-term pie in the sky goal for sure, but remembering that not all families are ready to bite off a full AAC device. It doesn't mean you can't follow best practice in development and give them the right tools and multimodal system that they need. Sometimes you've got to compromise what you think might be ideal, because ultimately your job is to leave the legacy that this family is going to be able to carry into the next phase of that child's life.
And it's not ideal if it's not meaningful and doable and what works for the client and their family.
Also,
Absolutely.
As the speech pathologist, it's not your job to decide things for people. It's your job to facilitate decisions that are in line with other people's values and perspectives. So I think, taking that as a lens, and I think a lot of times AAC has this connotation of an iPad, and it's just not, so you think, oh, we need AAC, so we have to go get this other thing. But you're talking about tiny, young babies who are maybe going to be working on gestures or other, conventional or unconventional. It doesn't necessarily, which is, completely appropriate. It doesn't necessarily have to be this new app that you found that you think is going to be great, and therefore you spend all of your intervention time convincing other people that you're right. And I feel like that doesn't help anyone.
Yeah, and I'd say, at the end of the day, we need to provide exposure to the language. So the platform upon which we do that can really look differently depending on all the other variables pressing in on the situation, right? I would not hold back in providing technology just because it's a young child, obviously, but we have to realize that there's other things going on in this environment that may prevent that, and that there are other workarounds to help you provide robust language when you don't have an iPad at your disposal. So, obviously we don't have time to talk about all the strategies, but I think that the big part of EI really is tackling buy-in. How do I help the family and the child buy into this idea of communicating differently, right? And keeping demands low, keeping naturalistic, joyful interactions paramount. And really that means modeling all day long, however we can, even with all my hands, which I do a lot with my kids. Right. And realizing that your job is to keep learning about this stuff. You're the first person a lot of the times that these complex communicators meet. And I think you have a role to play, a huge role in setting a legacy for them. That doesn't mean you fix it, but you help their families see hope. You help them see a path, and you give them hopefully a good foundation to enter into preschool and go on.
Can I ask you a question that I have to assume you get this, or you've dealt with this question a lot, either with your mentees or in your own practice? How to counsel a family who is extremely resistant to AAC of any kind? Or do you have, suggestions or strategies to get people on the same page, even if it's not anti-AAC, but there is some other conflict? I'm only thinking that because as we've described, a lot of times in our complex communicators at a young age, there's a lot going on. So these families are emotionally continually processing. They have lots of people in their house. They have work schedules. They have lives as well. So some of those communication skills they must be really important. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think the first step that I take is trying to understand where the resistance comes from. So you described a couple situations, right? Sometimes it comes from grief or fear, that this means you're giving up on my child's ability to speak. Sometimes it comes from conflicting information from other providers. And like you said, the family is just trying their best to take all these conflicting opinions in mind and make these big decisions. So I think it really behooves you to take the time to develop a trusting relationship with the family, and gradually start chipping away at this facade of rejection to the technology. I don't think dropping it ever works, right? I think a lot of clinicians get a little hesitant to have conversations when a family has expressed a dislike or a rejection of an idea. But I think that you can gently work with the family without trying to convince them or persuade them when you just take the time to try to understand why. So just first of all, why is this happening? Once you understand why, I think a lot of solutions unfold that you can explore, but they're not always going to fix the problem. So I think you really need to hear what families want for their child, even if it isn't exactly what you want for their child, right? And some families are perfectly capable and fine with their child communicating using nonverbal communication right now. They just can't take in anything else. So I would take that strength and that goal, and I would just make it explode with positive outcome, right? So if this is the way you prefer, let's work on partner assisted scanning. Let's get your kid to be the best yes knower on the face of the earth, right? And all the while, in your discharge at EI conference day, I'm going to put a handout in there about an AAC device, right? But I think that our job is really, we've got to help them reach their goals for their children.
That was so well said. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about other strategies for helping a family who might feel very overwhelmed. So I don't know how to use the technology, or how can I possibly model all day long, or I'm supposed to do this, but we have a wheelchair fitting. And I mean, in terms of, we've already discussed how AAC gets is at risk for being somewhat overlooked in the early intervention years. How do you navigate that conversation about prioritizing exposure when you have a very complex child with a whole lot of people trying to do a whole lot of things at once? Because you're right, we know how important those 3 years are.
What I've found through experience, and I would say, just to preface this, that aided language modeling is number one strategy. If that's all you teach the family to do, I think you're doing a really stand-up job in the EI environment. And so if we throw all the other demands away and that's the skill we focus on, what I have found is the more confident the family gets at that skill, the more they will do it without you imposing arbitrary goals on it. So I would suggest, going back to the other strategy that we talked about in meeting a family where they are in their strengths, is the first place that I introduce the concept of modeling is when they're already having a successful interaction together. Because if we ask families to model during something that is already feeling hard, 9 times out of 10, it isn't going to feel successful to anyone, including the child, right? So if we take our example of the choice making, which I think a lot of families feel really good about their ability to do that, that may be an environment where I would say, great, so during this choice making, I want you to find one word on this page, usually the front page of the system, so they don't have to do a lot of digging. One word that we could talk about during this routine, either while they're making their choice or after they've made their choice. So trying to kind of expand it away from requesting. Because what I see happen when we make it about requesting something is they think they're going into model and it ends up just saying, what do you want? And then they feel unsuccessful because the child's having a huge meltdown, and everybody just cries and it's not fun. So I think, understanding that starting with something that feels good, where everybody's happy and things are happening anyway, and then just adding one little step to it, you can slowly build a repertoire around that. And then keeping them on the first page is sometimes helpful, or going with really powerful words that the child already loves, like a personal core word or a core word, general core that happens to be really versatile, even if it's deeper into the system, can be a good place to start. And then I would go from there to say, each week I check in on how things are feeling. I keep everything very small. So if that's the one skill we're working on, we don't come in next week and work on a new one. We build on the success, right? Until I get the sense from the family, they're coming to me and reporting that something's going better without me asking. Then I feel that they're ready to take more on. So that might just be, let's do more words, or it might be, let's now bridge into more interactions.
I wonder if in the 10 or so minutes that we have left, if you could tell us a little bit more about how a clinician can increase their scope of competence in this area, because we've already outlined the many, many barriers that clinicians face in this realm. And our strategies, there are a lot of them. So I can imagine that this is, and I'm so glad you guys are putting on a conference about this, because there's obviously, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And I wonder if you could give us some additional resources or discuss other ways that clinicians could improve their scope.
Yes, I can. So the first thing I would suggest is getting a mentor. And that is likely not going to be somebody in your EI setting, or it might be, but you need to have somebody that you can check in with. So I think there's lots of places to connect with mentors. I have on Accessible a directory that people have submitted their information because they are specialists in AAC and are willing to connect with families and providers who want to learn more. ASHA has their ProFind, and ProFind can be a great place to go in and type in your state and look at people who specialize in AAC, self-proclaimed, right? So, buyer beware. You got to make sure not everybody has the best skills to give you as a mentor, but you're going to shop around and you're going to find someone you click with. But super, super essential to have a mentor. And then I think on top of that, as I said before, attending CE opportunities that are related specifically to other domains, not speech-language pathology, is really going to benefit you. So I would say things like seating and positioning. Closing the Gap has a bunch of conference sessions coming up on that. There's a conference locally here with Karen Kangas. I don't know if anybody in the room has ever been to a Karen Kangas training.
Yes,
she is awesome. Brilliant. It's actually virtual this year. It's the Northwest Augmentative Communication Society conference, and Karen is presenting. And just getting a better understanding of how the body impacts communication and learning can be a game changer for you in this EI realm. So anything on seating and positioning, I would suggest anything on vision. Soak up the vision. Perkins School for the Blind has this branch called CVI Now.
So good.
So good. So good. And some of their stuff is free. even if it's not free, if you see any majority of or any portion of your caseload of children who have neurological insult, they probably have cortical vision impairment, even if they don't have a diagnosis yet. So just get in there and get educated on it. And I think Perkins School is a really great place to do that. I also think if you're working with children on the autism spectrum, which who isn't, right? Then it really serves you well to get trained in things like DIR floor time or any relationship-based intervention that feels like it matches your philosophy. Just learning how to support engagement and social interaction and respecting sensory accessibility is huge for working with little ones on the autism spectrum. What am I missing? Anything that helps you figure out how to play? Because I don't know about you guys, but we think we know how to play when we graduate. We don't know how to play. We don't.
Playing makes me tired. I'm
old.
It
makes me so tired.
I'm too old to play.
Which
is why I don't work in early intervention. I feel completely comfortable saying that. I should just defending myself here for a second.
Yeah, Amy mentioned that idea of high affect earlier in our call, right? And I learned this concept from an OT colleague when I got here to Seattle. In OT, they call it therapeutic use of self, right? I don't know if you've ever heard
fancier.
that. It's real fancy. Yeah. But really, it's using yourself as an extension of the play to entice and engage and provide joy to the child. And man, that goes a long way. When you think it's an attention issue, it's usually an engagement issue. If they're not paying attention to you, it's because something else is more interesting, and it's your problem, not their problem. So anything that helps you learn how to play better, learn how to think about play differently, anything from Hannon on play, totally worth reading. They have these books called Let's Rock Play.
Yes.
And they talk about people games and people toys.
And
so
those are
huge.
Super accessible books too. They have like cute little cartoon drawings. Like they're just a fun, yeah.
They do. And they're great for parents because Hannon is just great for parents, right? But I think a lot of the times in EI, a huge struggle with complex communicators is figuring out how to help their family interact with them. It's hard to play and talk to a child with so much going on. You don't get the natural reward, right, that you get from interacting with a child who has more social strengths or more verbal strengths. So I think a lot of our work, even though it's not really AAC, right, it is, because they need to be able to have joy. Otherwise, they're not going to have any time to model all the things you're asking them to model. So yeah, anything around play, social engagement, huge importance. I don't think I left anything out.
Well, when you and I were talking before we started recording, you had also mentioned some literature, and we will have at least one of the references that you mentioned listed in the show notes, an article by Light and McNaughton from 2015. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit specifically about that article, but I also wanted to make sure you mentioned the research library that you have available on accessible.org for people.
Yes, absolutely. So because the Light and McNaughton article is like a novel written for researchers and not practitioners, I still recommend that you read it, because my philosophy on how to kind of approach improving our service delivery really is rooted in these gurus of the field, their perspective. So it is in the show notes. I really highly recommend you read it. But I wanted to really direct you also to we have a section on our website called the Stacks, like a library stack. And we have tons of stuff in there, but what I'm really excited to keep building is a research collection. And one branch of that research collection is specifically on early intervention with AAC. And I think some of the prominent names in the field, like Romsky and Sebek, are noted quite a bit in that research collection. And they talk a lot about the importance of EI, including AAC, but also how to approach the myths that are still very pervasive in that field. So check it out. You can see it on our website, accessible.org, under the resource tab, the Stacks. Lots of research in there. And anything that is by Romsky and Sebek, I think, is worth reading. Also, anything by Charity Rolland is worth reading in this field of early intervention, just to give yourself a framework for approaching assessment. I could go on, but they're all in there. Just read them. Read all of them.
This is a wealth of resources, and we're so grateful. in our last minute, do you have any words of wisdom or closing remarks?
So I would say,
That was a really good sigh, just letting you know.
dear EISLP, you are doing a good job. You really are. This is hard work, some of the most rewarding work, but so hard, and you're doing awesome. So be gentle on yourself, be patient on yourself, be patient with your families and your clients, and do your best to keep learning, knowing that every kid you see, every complex communicator is just going to teach you volumes. So that would be my word of wisdom to leave.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. This was so great. I mean, we've worked with you before on a variety of projects, but you are always just such a wealth of information, and I love listening to you, and we've learned so much from you. Thank you so much again for coming on and chatting with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And anybody who is listening, Tana is so accessible. You should find her on Instagram, send her a message, send her an email if you're listening and you have questions. You are not only a wealth of information, but incredibly collaborative and supportive of other SLPs on their learning journey. So don't hesitate. And again, Tana, just thank you a million times.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. As always, you can use this episode for ASHA CEUs. You can also potentially use this episode for other credits depending on the regulations of your governing body. To determine if this episode will count towards professional development in your area of study, please check in with your governing bodies, or you can go to our website, www.slpnerdcast.com. All of the references and information listed throughout the course of the episode will be listed in the show notes. And as always, if you have any questions, please email us at info@slpnerdcast.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to welcome you back here again soon. Another big thank you to our corporate sponsors, MedTravelers, who helped make this episode possible. Our corporate sponsors keep our CEU prices low and our program ad-free. MedTravelers is your industry leader for exclusive allied healthcare travel opportunities. MedTravelers has benefits like higher earning potential, W-2 employee status, and a flexible schedule. Visit medtravelers.com to learn more. MedTravelers did not participate in creating the contents of this episode.